Hey everyone, Count Vamps here. I'm here to have a chat about paints. So I had a fan and a friend reach out and ask me what kind of paints I use. So I thought I'd just cover the paints and some paintbrushes and some accessories just to sort of give everyone a general idea on what kind of paints I use. And also sort of hopefully informing some new painters, sort of some missteps I've made and how to avoid them. So I'm going to talk about the different kinds of paint I have, which basically there's 6 varieties. We've got regular, we've got speed paint, we've got washes, airbrush, primer, and texture paint. So all these do different things. I'll cover washes and texture paint at the end of the paint section. Otherwise, I'm just going to cover them via brand, and we'll start at sort of like the more popular ones down into the less known ones. Okay, cool. So we got Citadel as the starting paint brand. These are pretty common. I'm not the biggest fan of Citadel. They are quite good. They've got a nice color variety. They're good for beginners because they have the base, layer, and highlight sort of colors that go up. So they're easy to learn. The problem I have with these is that they are a bit too thick. I do not like pots. Pots tend to dry paint out. I've never really been happy with pots. I also don't like them for when you're transferring them to a palette. It's just a lot of extra work. So I have moved my Citadel paints that I've got into droppers, which you do by just adding a bit of medium to them and dropping some glass balls in so they agitate. Overall, I think that Games Workshop is a pretty good range. They're easy to find. I do think they're a little expensive, and they can be a bit of a pain to thin, but they're not like bad to thin either. But yeah, so Citadel, that's some of the ones I use. Then I got Army Painter next. Army Painter. So let's get the sort of mixed bag out of the way first. The regular paint range. I'm not the biggest fan of the regular paint range. It's very hit and miss. Some colors are really good. I've got an orange that's fantastic. This white is not great. It's not terrible either. I was looking for a different kind of white, but these are the only ones they had in stock. They are in dropper bottles, so that's a benefit. But yeah, the main Army Painter range, if it's your first paint set, that's fine. That's all good. You'll probably be okay. Otherwise, if you're a bit more experienced, you'll have to sort of do a bit of research on whether or not that paint is particularly good in Army Painter. So a bit of hit and miss, but not terrible. They're also easy to find, so that's always positive. And of course, we got the speed paint range. So speed paints and contrast paints by extension are great. If you've ever seen the slap chop technique, this is what they're basically primarily used for, but they can just be painted straight over a white miniature. Probably don't try with a straight black miniature. It's not going to get the effect you want. But a white primed mini is going to look fantastic with this. Well, not fantastic, but it'll do the job, and it's nice and quick. I think that Army Painter have the best speed paints. They're great. I use them as washes as well, and I use them as shades. So I really don't have a problem with Army Painter speed paints. In fact, I would recommend Army Painter speed paints as the speed paint to go to. They're also pretty cheap, so that's always a positive. Okay, next one is Vallejo. Vallejo, I like these guys. They've got a lot of different ranges. They do texture paint and all that. So do Army Painter, by the way. They've also got effects paint, which is sort of like texture paint, but it goes on minis. So I've got 2 varieties, personally. I've got game color, which is sort of like your tabletop miniature game. And there's also model color, which is more for your sort of airplanes and battleships and stuff like that. But you can use them interchangeably. Their model color range obviously is a bit more realistic in the color range. Their game color is a bit more, whoa, look at these guys on the tabletop. I like Vallejo. They're a good paint brand. They are nice in the price range area, and they've also sorted out a couple of back issues that they were having, which you can do some research on that. I will say that they have just been bought out by a new company, so in 5-6 months this may not be accurate, but at the moment they're good for the price point, and I like them. They thin really effectively too, which is great. I haven't had any problems with them. I do have a wash from theirs as well. It's good. as I said, I'll get into washes as I go along. So, now we're going to go into the sort of deep cuts area of my paint collection. So we're going to start with my second favorite paint range, Reaper. Reaper's really good. They're a bit hard to find in Australia, which is why I don't 100% recommend them for Australians. There is a website called Tabletop Empires. They stock these, but you can only really get them online. You're not going to go into a store and buy them off the shelf. But they're great. They're just the right thickness for base colors, and then they have the durability that when they get thin, they stay good. Also, they're in dropper bottles. I do recommend, though, when you get them, crack the top open and drop some glass balls into these suckers, which I will talk about that kind of stuff in the accessories section. But yeah, Reaper paints, really good. I like the color vibrancy. They got a great range. No problem. I have not used their washes, so can't really state on that one, but I got plenty of washes. That's fine. The next one I've got is Badger Hill, which is an airbrush range. I've used them in my airbrush. They're good. I have zero problems with them. They are a bit more expensive than the other paints that I've got, but that's fine. Well, except for one. They are also just really good at when you get thinned. Like, if you need a thin coat of orange in this particular scenario, they're just really good for just putting that on, because they sort of are in between sort of speed paints and regular paint in viscosity. So yeah, Badger Hill, good miniatures. They got a pretty decent paint range for airbrush paints, so no problems with them. Now we get to this, my favorite. We've got Two Thin Coats. Two Thin Coats is the best paint range I've currently used. It's thick enough that it's good base, and when you thin it, it thins just perfectly for regardless of what level of highlight you do. Also, they do the Games Workshop thing where they've got like a base, a layer, and a highlight, even though they call them slightly different things, but it's the same thing. So it's pretty beginner friendly. I will say, probably don't start 100% with these because you do need to thin. But if you're already aware of how to thin paints, these guys are the ones to go with. They are a bit more expensive. They're the most expensive paint that I buy. But if I could buy the whole entire range, I absolutely would. They are fantastic. They're also releasing 60 new colors very shortly. So 180 color range it'll be. And that is fantastic. So zero problems with these. I love the color range. I love the consistency. I love how they thin. I have nothing bad to say about this range. Literally, I could struggle and still not find something bad to say. Okay, so the last paint I've got is this cheap acrylic. I use this for slap chop because you don't need to use fancy paints for slap chopping, and then because you do the speed paint. So this is what I use to do the white highlight layer. I've also got a grey that I use, and obviously I've got black primer that I've got, which is from Vallejo. So primers and these kind of paints, yeah, you just use them as they say on the can. The primer also goes in the airbrush, so which is what I recommend doing. Airbrushing primer on is way more effective than painting it on, but you can paint it on if you don't have an airbrush or you're worried about inhaling a bunch of fumes or whatever it may be. The cheap stuff I just use for terrain and vehicles and yeah, getting that sort of like slap chop method going. I wouldn't recommend using it for fine detail on miniatures. It just is not a good idea. Don't do that. But having cheap paint around is fine. Okay, so washes. So washes, my washes are mostly Games Workshop. They are in dropper bottles now. I can't really say yay or nay on a lot of wash ranges. I like using Games Workshop. I've got a couple of other ranges. I've got a Reaper and I've got a Vallejo. They're both good. I've never really come across a bad wash, and I think it's based on what you may use it for. I recommend testing washes. Washes are one of those things that you just got to test and figure out this color and this brand is good. Generally, though, you're pretty safe with washes. You can make your own, but that's not the video for this. So, and then also I've got this texture paint from Games Workshop. Texture paint is pretty straightforward. You paint it. When it dries, it has a texture. I've never really found a good or bad brand of texture paint. it pretty much does what it says on the tin. You paint it on, it ends up looking like the piece of terrain that's meant to be mimicking by the end of it. They are cool. I do recommend them. The other one that I did mention just before is Effects Paint, and basically the idea with them is they sort of do the similar thing but on a miniature. So there's like rust effects, for example. You paint the rust effect on, and when it dries, it looks rust. It looks like rust. So texture and effects paints I sort of put under the same umbrella. So I think that's about it on paints. Now, I'm planning to review more paints in the future. That's just what I got on hand right now. Awesome. Let's get to brushes. So basically, I've got 2 brushes to show here, and the reason is that you'll only really need really good brushes and cheap ass brushes, in my personal opinion. I do recommend don't get any branded brushes. And when I say brand, I mean like Army Painter or Games Workshop or any of those places that sell paint. Don't get their paint brushes. They're generally overpriced and they perform worse than most other brushes. This is a cheap ass brush. I've had this longer than all of my Game Workshop brushes, basically, except for my dry brushes, which it's a dry brush. You use them, fraying and stuff like that. But Army Painter, I've got a brush here from Army Painter. It's been used twice and it's frayed more than every other brush I've ever used. Games Workshop is pretty similar. So don't buy branded paint brand brushes, basically. So let's talk about cheap-ass brushes first before I get into the expensive ones. So this is one from AliExpress, which is basically Wish. It's a different version of Wish. I got 30 brushes of 3 different varieties for $6. They're now 8, not 6, but still cheap as hell. I still have about 4 of each brushes left. I've had them for over 10 years. So, cheap ass brushes. And then when you use them and abuse them, you throw them out. They're like 20 cents a brush. And they're pretty much better. I find they're better than the Games Workshop equivalent. And also, when you wreck a $20 brush, you don't go, oh man, I spent like $5 on this Games Workshop brush. You go, oh, I spent like 20 cents on this piece of crap, and throw it out. I will talk about saving these brushes though after I talk about this brush. So this is a Da Vinci Kolinsky Sable. I don't really have any massive brand recommendation on Kolinsky Sable. Make sure you get Kolinsky Sable. Some of them will say they're Kolinsky Sable, they're not. This brush I only use for fine detail. It is very well looked after. It is washed after every use, and it is brush soaped after every use. This thing is probably better manicured than I am. So, speaking of which, brush soap. This is the Masters. This is a great brand. So basically, if you get a Sable brush or any kind of decent brush, get brush soap. This stuff will save you. When you finish painting with this, brush soap it. Put it back into its point. It will stay there. It will love you and it will stay consistent. And the best part is that you can use brush soap on your crappy brushes as well. And they will survive. They will last longer. You use them on any other brush. Probably don't use them on a dry brush. It's probably a bit of a waste at that point. But yes, brush soap. Absolutely get brush soap if you're getting expensive brushes. I do recommend, if you are a beginner, just get these cheap, crappy ones and throw them out. When you get more practiced, when you understand how to use brushes and brush strokes and brush care, and your paint has hit a ceiling because your brush is not doing what you want it, that's when you buy a Sable brush. That's my advice. And get some brush soap. Don't use your Sable brush until you get brush soap. Alright, great. So, we got brushes. We've got brush soap. Now I'm going to talk quickly about 4 different sort of categories of item that I use on a daily basis. We'll start with the humble paint cup. This paint cup has been in with me since I first started painting Warhammer about 20 years ago. It's just a cup. Don't buy a fancy cup. Just get a cup or a glass, fill it with water. It has now become your paint glass. Preferably don't use a glass that you drink out of the same size consistently, because otherwise you'll end up drinking paint water, and that's not fun. I've actually never drank paint water, but I imagine it's not fun. The next one is the wet palette. This is my wet palette. I made this. You can buy a wet palette, that's fine, but don't go buying a crazy ass wet palette. So a wet palette basically is, I got a lidded container. I put some chucks in the bottom, which I cut to size, about 3 or 4 thick. You add water to it. You pour the excess water off. You stick a sheet of baking paper on top, and you put your paints on and you start painting. And then as you use it, you put the lid back on each day, and your paints will last a lot longer. In fact, even if they dry out on the wet palette, you can just add a bit of water to them and they'll come back to life. This thing will save you a lot of money and a lot of paint. This cost me less than maybe like $3 to get off the ground. You can buy an actual wet palette too, that's fine, but definitely get a wet palette. You can also use dry palettes. They're good for dry brushing. I really recommend a wet palette. If you're going to only have one palette, get a wet palette. But dry palettes are useful. I also use these little fidget toys as a palette. What I use these for? Washes and speed paints, because you just drop them in, and then when they dry, you pop them out, and they're clean. I've got about 3 of these. That's what I use them for. Don't go too crazy. The next thing is glass balls. Glass balls are great. What you do is you grab a couple of these, you drop them in a paint container of yours, and then when you shake them, it will agitate the paint. You can also use steel balls, stainless steel balls though. The reason I use glass is because you can't advertise glass as something that isn't glass. If you buy cheap stainless steel balls, they may just be steel and they will rust and ruin your paint. So glass balls are my recommendation, but you know, if you get your stainless steel balls from someone reputable, you're probably fine. If you buy them off AliExpress though, you're probably going to get bitten in the ass. As you do. Okay, and then we've got finally my paint shaker. This is just a vortex shaker. It's not currently working because it's not plugged in. I unplugged it so I can hold it up. This one is a cheap one off AliExpress for $30. You can get them branded, like a decent brand, for like $70. The only difference between the two is that this is slightly louder. I recommend just getting a paint shaker. They're good. If you've got a really dense like paint, like it hasn't been used for a while, you could be sitting there shaking for like 5-10 minutes. This will take like 2 minutes of just holding it onto the vortex shaker. I highly recommend getting one of these if you're going to be serious about painting. But I'd probably put this on the back end of things that you want. I'd probably even say once you practice enough, Kolinsky sable brush first, then this thing. But if you're doing a lot of painting, shaking it up with a vortex shaker is just the best. So, you know, that's pretty much that's pretty much it. Like, I've covered everything. I do have an airbrush. I've got an Awada. I'm not really an expert on airbrushes, so I'm not comfortable really talking about it in great detail. If you're using an airbrush for just base coating stuff, get whatever. It's fine. If you're using an airbrush for proper sort of airbrush painting, get a decent brand like an Awada or something like that. Keep in mind, take good care of the needles, get spare needles. That's why mine's currently just sitting there. I need to get a new needle. But they are really good for priming a ton of minis, and they don't use a lot of paint. This will go a long way in an airbrush comparatively to painting it on. It'll be fine either way. But yeah, so that's about it for this particular video. So in the future, I am planning to talk about new paints that I'm going to get. I'm going to have a explore on other paint ranges, and I'll let you know what I think about them. I'll probably wait until I get 5 or 6 of them different paint ranges before I do that video. The next ones will be talking about the different war games that I'm playing and just sort of reviewing some war games in general. My very next absolute video that I'm going to be doing is talking about Games Workshop. I've decided that I'm just going to bite the bullet and get that one out of the way as soon as I can. Basically just why they probably won't be appearing much on YouTube or my Twitch channel. But I'll leave that for the next video. Anyway, guys, thanks so much for joining me. I hope me explaining some paint ranges and stuff helped someone out there out. As I said, this video is really more for like very beginner brand new sort of paint guys. If you want to learn some extra paint techniques, someone like Non-John, he's pretty good, or Squidmar. Those guys will give you the real sort of heavy paint tips that'll get your painting to the next level. I'm just a talky guy who talks about beginner stuff basically at the moment. Anyway, you have a good one, and I'll catch you either next stream or next YouTube video. You guys have a good one.